Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for normal human beings and trade nerds alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today is a frequent now guest of the podcast, Laura Deegan. Laura, welcome back to Embargoed.
Glad to be back on Embargoed as always.
All right. Well, today we're going to do something very exciting. I think there's 29 days now until the presidential election in the United States. And by all accounts, it is a very close election. So sitting here on October 9th in Washington, D.C., we have no idea who is going to be president of the United States in 2025. So what we've decided to do today is to have a talk about how U.S. sanctions policy might be affected depending upon whether the vice president wins or whether former President Trump wins the election. And so why don't we start with some kind of opening vibes about just kind of general thoughts about how the different presidential candidates might play into sanctions policy, and then we'll talk maybe country by country, and maybe we'll talk some personnel as well.
Yeah, and maybe it's a good time before we dive in just to give a plug for an event that we are having at our firm tomorrow at 2 p.m. in Washington, D.C. If you're local to the area, please look at the invite, which we've posted on LinkedIn, which will go over a bit more on sanctions on the ballot, so to speak, and we'll have some really exciting government speakers and speakers from different EU law firms as well.
Definitely. This may have already happened by the time this podcast actually goes out, but hopefully a lot of the listeners will have stopped by our offices in Washington. But if not, I think we're going to record the sanctions on the ballot session as well. And so if you want to listen to that afterwards and kind of hear some of the thoughts from other panelists besides us on how the election might affect sanctions policy. And also on that panel, we're going to be talking about how the UK elections affected UK sanctions policy and how the EU elections earlier this summer affected EU sanctions policy. So it should be a good time.
Yes, looking forward to it. And I guess more to your, general thoughts. Either way, come January, we are going to have an entirely different administration. Under Harris administration, maybe that looks very similar to Biden's current economic sanctions policy. Under a Trump administration, does that look like policies that he had instituted at this point in 2017. It's really anyone's guess. But either way, I think it's safe to say, and I think Timmy would agree, that it's likely more sanctions are coming.
Yeah, I think either way, the lawyers are going to be the winners here because there are going to be more sanctions coming, because what we saw from the Trump administration was that sanctions were a policy of first resort. I mean, really, the Trump administration, I think, took very seriously the idea that sanctions were kind of the economic alternative to warfare and imposed them in some ways that were more aggressive than what we'd seen before, and some ways that were just very different than anything we'd seen before. And I'm thinking a little bit about this International Criminal Court sanction program that was around for a little while during the Trump administration, which is like nothing else I've ever seen. I don't know about you, Laura, but I also think that with respect to Vice President Harris, it's obviously too soon to tell. I mean, I haven't heard anything I haven't heard her talk about U.S. sanctions during the course of this election. She's, it's been a short campaign and she's had a lot to talk about, and sanctions just hasn't really been on the front burner like it was in 2016 and in 2020 in terms of like the political discussion. But I think, the hallmarks of the Biden administration sanctions policy have really been this multilateralism. I mean, the real program that their focus has been on Russia, which has had the support of the allies. And I think the Biden administration has been very careful to try and garner support of the allies. I would expect that based on what she said more generally about foreign policy during the campaign, that Vice President Harris would probably lean in the direction of that sort of multilateralism. I think the Trump administration policy was very unilateral. I mean, the focus on Venezuela, which is kind of U.S. unilateral sanctions policy, although the Biden administration has continued the Venezuela sanctions, and more recently, in light of the election in Venezuela this summer, looks like it may ramp them up. We haven't seen that yet, and we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. But it does seem like if President Harris wins, it may be a continuation of the theme of multilateralism. And if President Trump wins, I think unilateralism seems to be more generally his view of foreign policy. I also took a look at Project 2025 and what it had to say about sanctions and getting ready for the podcast. Not that President Trump has committed to doing anything within Project 2025. He said he likes some parts of it, doesn't like other parts of it, didn't have anything to do with it. And so we don't know that would be his policy, but it was something to look at as to what might happen. And it wasn't, at least the parts that I saw were not real clear about sanctions policy, but they did have a country by country discussion. And I will say on that one, and we'll talk about Russia as well, I think most of what they said was pretty boilerplate, but the stuff about Russia was a little bit more, I don't want to say nuanced, but it basically said the Republicans are divided into lots of different camps with respect to Russia, and here are the three camps, and we'll have to figure out a policy that makes them all happy, was, at least as I read Project 2025, that's what it looked like. So it kind of left things a lot more open with respect to Russia than with respect to other countries. But with that, why don't we turn a little bit to, first off, staffing. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about potential staffing in a Harris administration, Laura, because at least right now, one of the top officials in her campaign is Brian Nelson, who was just recently left from over at Treasury as the undersecretary that was in terrorism and financial intelligence, which is kind of the undersecretary that is over OFAC. And so that could be interesting in terms of what happens in a potential Harris administration.
Yeah, and I mean, I think on that point, that's why, under a Harris administration, we might see a continuing policies when it comes to economic sanctions that President Biden has put in place, because Undersecretary Nelson, or former Undersecretary Nelson, was someone who was appointed with the guidance of Vice President Harris. You could certainly see a scenario where Brian Nelson is put into another high-ranking position, either within Treasury or within the Department of State. But either way, there are still a lot of political appointees in the Biden administration right now, and under a Harris administration, it could be likely that a lot of those political appointees will stay in their current position within Treasury. And so if that scenario comes into play, then you really might not see much difference in terms of economic sanctions policy. And for the most part, it does seem that President Biden and Vice President Harris have been seemingly, at least to the public, aligned on economic sanctions, on support to Ukraine, on Russia, etc. What could be interesting under a Trump administration is, again, political appointees in office who might not come from a traditional government background. And I think we might have seen that with the last Secretary of the Treasury under the Trump administration, or folks who have more of a business background, essentially, especially when it comes to the role of the Secretary of the Treasury. The other thing you might see is something that President Trump had did during his term in office, which was the removal of State Department's Office of Sanctions Coordination, which essentially is an office that helps coordinate sanctions amongst, for example, EU allies, UK, etc., and helps put in place sanctions policy that then agencies like OFAC are in charge of implementing. And so during the last Trump administration, we did see that office abolished, and then it was put back into place under the Biden administration. That is certainly a possibility, in which case, I think to your point, Tim, we could see less alignment by a second term President Trump with the EU and the UK in rolling out new sanctions.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense, and I think it also makes sense, given the way that the Trump administration the first time around was inclined to proceed kind of on its own, that it got rid of the Office of Sanctions Coordination. It also makes a lot of sense given President Biden's focus on, allied cooperation and kind of working in tandem with the allies, that President Biden brought it back. The sense that I get from a Vice President Harris administration is that it could well be, kind of just a continuation of the Biden administration on sanctions, particularly, as you point out, Laura, that Brian Nelson, is involved in her campaign and probably would play a role in this area if she were to win. So you'd have kind of continuity of personnel. I think that the one thing in terms of appointees is that it has been very difficult to kind of figure out who President Trump's appointees would be in this area. As you pointed out the last time around, there weren't kind of some of the usual suspects from kind of the Republican side, but previous government experience. I think the sense that I'm getting, not just with respect to Treasury, but in all areas right now, is that this Trump administration might focus even less on government experience than the last one did if he were to take office a second time. And so it's really kind of unclear to me who would be calling the shots in a Trump Treasury Department. That said, my sense the last time around was that a lot of decisions, even that normally were kind of made at the technocratic level within OFAC, were made more at the political level in the Trump administration. And I think you'd probably see that in a second Trump administration as well, that you had a lot more decisions coming from the White House than was the norm.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and I think evidence of that might be something you pointed to earlier, which was the issuance of the International Criminal Court sanctions, where the Trump administration had placed sanctions on the ICC for sort of allegedly attacking certain former processes of the U.S. government when it came to activity in Iraq. And so, I think at the time the ICC sanctions were put into place, a lot of people thought, well, is this the purpose of sanctions? Is this what we would see a future or a second term President Trump use sanctions for, to place prohibitions on outside persons or companies that he deems as a threat. And I think part of, why you would see the issuance of programs like that is because perhaps the people in those high-ranking appointed positions in Treasury are not career government officials. And so there's often sometimes, or there can be in those circumstances, a lack of understanding of the purpose of sanctions. That said, there a lot of those people that were in the former Trump administration, I think, quickly learned how Treasury and OFAC processes worked, but there is a bit of a learning curve if he decides to appoint personnel who, let's say, are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, as opposed to people that have been government employees working within foreign policy for decades.
Yeah, I think we saw some of that learning curve in connection with, in particular, the Roussel and Deripaska designations, where, I think you had a Treasury Secretary who was not, at least as I understand it at the time, not particularly well versed in U.S. sanctions policy, kind of over OFAC, going into to Congress, kind of getting grilled about the oligarch list, coming back and saying during the hearing that there would be some oligarchs who would be sanctioned, and then like a month later they come out with a list. It was the Forbes list, and then they start sanctioning entities, but it has a huge effect on the world aluminum markets, and so they've got to issue general licenses that were not just for wind down but were for maintenance, and they got very involved in a divestment. And I think that's the sort of thing that kind of exemplifies the sort of learning curve that you can have when you kind of are making sanctions decisions more at the political level than at the technocratic level. That said, I mean, we are a democracy, and in a democracy, the political people are the ones that have been elected by the people to make the big decisions, and so there's not a problem with it per se, but sometimes it does lead to hiccups.
Yeah, and to that point, it would be interesting to see if under a second term Trump presidency, Congress starts enacting more sanctions legislation that appears to or tries to tie the hands of President Trump.
Well, and with that, I mean, that's a good lead into why don't we talk first about Russia? The last time around, the scenario you just described, Laura, was basically what happened with respect to Russia, where there were sanctions in place when President Trump took office in 2016 relating to the invasion of Ukraine and the occupation of Ukraine by Russia. And those sanctions were relatively limited, but they've been in place since 2014. President Trump takes office. There is some discussion about whether he's going to lift those sanctions. And Congress, in a very bipartisan manner, with veto-proof majorities, passed CATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act, that locked in the Crimea sanctions and did a number of other things to kind of heighten sanctions against the Russian government. And this was in 2017. So they locked it in. President Trump at that point couldn't have rolled back the sanctions if he wanted to. Now, he signed the law, but it was clear that if he hadn't signed the law, there would have been an override at the time. And so, Russia, since then, the Biden administration has not proceeded under CATSA. So at that point, we have an entire program, the main Russia sanctions program that's arisen out of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, is authorized under IEPA, the normal sanctions authority, not under CATSA, so it, at least in theory, could be rolled back. It'll be interesting to see if President Trump wins, whether or not there's a discussion about whether, either the Russia sanctions, the harmful activity sanctions of the current program get locked in under the CATSA authorities, or whether Congress passes a new authority to lock them in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what's at the forefront of everybody's mind because I think the thinking is, when President Trump, or if we see a second term President Trump in office, will his first order of business be to roll back some of those 2022 and still current Russia sanctions that you rightly point out were issued under IEPA just through an executive order. Executive orders can easily, be rescinded by the next president. That would be something very simple. But then you would really be leaving it in the hands of Congress, where there is probably arguably a more divided Congress, at least with respect to Russia and Ukraine, than there was in 2017. And so in that case, my thinking is, if you are relying on Congress to codify these expanded Russia-related sanctions, will that actually happen with our current Congress?
Yeah, I do think that that's an important thing to keep in mind and to watch if President Trump takes office again, is that my sense is that in 2017, 2018, President Trump's control even over Republican Congress was limited. My sense is that from 2021 on, and certainly when the Republicans took control of the House in 2022, that President Trump's control over Congress is far greater out of office right now than it ever was when he was in office. And I can't see another situation where you could get almost unanimity with respect to a law like CATSA that, at least in theory, the president opposed. It's hard for me to believe that scenario would happen again. And so if President Trump didn't want to lock in sanctions through legislation, I would think that it would be hard to see a situation where there would be veto-proof majorities in the House and the Senate that would, override his veto. So that's, I think, very important to keep in mind, is that it's not clear to me that Congress is going to be able to do anything despite what a new President Trump wanted. So with that, what about President Harris? If a President Harris takes office, what do we think her policies would look like with respect to Russia?
Again, because a lot of the political appointees within Treasury had been appointed, I believe, with the close advice of Vice President Harris, I think we will still continue to see a lot of coordination amongst the G7 and the EU and the UK in rolling out Russia-related sanctions at the continued pace that they have been doing. I think we will continue to see a push for funding for Ukraine, which there's also been a bit of contention in Congress about, so that will be a hurdle for her as well. But I do think that the coordination piece is going to be key moving forward. One thing about this current administration, and I think something we would expect to see under Harris administration, is there is a lot of involvement and collaboration amongst the G7 and certainly amongst OFAC, agencies like OFAC and OFSI in the UK. There's even been cases where OFAC and OFSI are doing exchanges where you have personnel who are detailed across the pond. And I think that we would just see that relationship get even closer under a Harris administration. Now, do I think that we will end up seeing a large-scale escalation of U.S. sanctions on Russia? That's hard to say. I think it would more just be this continued wait-and-see approach and collaboration with the G7 until perhaps there's some further, perhaps military escalation on Russia's part.
Okay, so that's Russia. So why don't we talk now about Iran and what it would look like in the two administrations. Now, in 2016 and 2020, Iran was an issue in the presidential elections. In 2016, President Trump ran against the nuclear deal that President Obama had just entered into, and when he won, he essentially spent 2 years telling Iran he'd like to renegotiate it, and when Iran said, we're not going to renegotiate the deal, President Trump pulled the United States out of the deal, and we went back into a secondary sanctions situation with Iran. What do you think happens this time around? Because we're still out of the nuclear deal. In 2020, President Biden ran on getting back into the nuclear deal, and there was some, by at least according to media reports, some serious attempt to do that, but it didn't happen. And I will say where we are in 2024 is that the Biden administration, from everything I've seen, is aggressively enforcing secondary sanctions against Iran, aggressively enforcing primary sanctions against Iran. I've seen lots of enforcement activity in all different sectors. And so it's not clear to me if President Trump takes office where there is to go with respect to Iran that is kind of more aggressive, because I think if anything, the Biden administration has turned out to be more aggressive on the Iran sanctions than the Trump administration was, or at least equally so.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting one because the issue of Iran is actually one where President Trump briefly mentioned in the first debate with, or the only debate with Vice President Kamala Harris, where he did make some reference that, them referring to the current Biden administration had rolled back sanctions with Iran, which I think, as we know, is probably not true. Is not true. Iran is still comprehensively sanctioned. To your point, OFAC has consistently been designating parties in Iran or related to Iran's support of Hamas. But I think under a Trump administration, the messaging regarding a President Trump going hard on Iran will continue. There would be likely to be more designations of Iran or of Iranian persons or persons who support Iran to support the messaging that a Trump administration is continuing to go hard on Iran. That said, I did see a news article a few days ago that actually said that Trump, President Trump, would not necessarily be opposed to talking about renegotiating of the JCPOA because of the concern that Iran would just continue to build up a nuclear arsenal. So that was a surprising article, and if true, I certainly think it will be interesting to see if Trump could hold true on that promise, a promise of when I get in office, we will force the Iranians to renegotiate. Do I think that will happen the way that maybe he would like? Likely not. And then we would maybe be back to the scenario of public messaging about again having done the most designations on Iran, which is messaging that I think he'd used during his last term.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem. I will say this. So let me preface all this by saying that pretty much everything I have expected to happen with respect to Iran in the last few years has been wrong. So this could well be too. But I do think with a President Trump, there is this kind of Nixon goes to China type type sense that I get. And what I mean by that is President Trump has been, very aggressive about Iran in his first term, when he ran before his first term, in between terms. So he is never going to be portrayed as soft on Iran, just as Nixon was never going to be portrayed as soft on China, which is what would give him, if he wants to, the ability to probably make a deal and sell a deal with Iran that even a President Harris really wouldn't have, because if she were to make a deal with Iran, you can bet that it would be painted as soft on Iran, and that it probably wouldn't have the support of any Republicans in Congress, and may not have the support of a lot of Democrats in Congress, because President Obama had a tough time getting congressional support, even to just for congressional veto purposes. So I think President Trump could do it if he wanted to. The question is, why on earth would he want to, since he has talked so tough on Iran consistently? I will say this. My sense has always been that President Trump likes to be perceived as a deal maker, and that one of the things that he didn't like about the Iran deal originally was that President Obama negotiated it, and he thought he could make a better deal than President Obama. And I think that's what he spent the first 2 years of his term trying to prove, or his first term trying to prove, was I'm going to get a better deal than Obama did. And he didn't manage to do that, but I think the opportunity would be there if he were to take the presidency again, that he could try and make that deal another time around, and he might want to make the deal just for the sake of making a deal and showing that he could do that. So I have some hope in a Trump administration that we might get some sort of grand bargain that might surprise us. But as I said, I'm consistently wrong about these sorts of issues, so you should take that for whatever it's worth. With a Vice President Harris, if she were to become president, I'll be interested to see, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. Iran has been a pretty unilateral sanctions policy since 2016, because once we got into the nuclear deal, there was coordination, and then when we pulled out, it was pretty much we were at odds with the allies, sometimes very serious odds. I mean, that was what President Biden talked about in his 2020 campaign, was that he was going to repair relationships with the allies, and one of the things that was straining that relationship was the failure to honor the terms of the JCPOA. And so I'll be curious to see, now that I think there's a lot more consensus about some of the foreign policy issues that Iran is actually creating in the Middle East between the United States and the allies, whether or not President Harris decides to bring in a multilateral coalition with respect to Iran, the same way President Biden has brought together a multilateral coalition with respect to Russia.
That would be interesting to see. Can it be done, or could it be done to the same scale that it has been done for Russia? I'm not so sure, because you still have a lot of obviously EU countries who are doing perfectly lawful non-US activity with Iran and want to continue to engage in that sort of business. I mean, you've obviously seen, the EU look to Iran and its support of Hamas, and particularly with current tension in the Middle East, and show disdain for it. I think that's there, and I think you could certainly maybe see more collaboration between the U.S. and the EU on, let's say, a small amount of designations. Maybe anything more than that might be a hard pill for the EU, and especially EU companies who are doing business with Iran. A hard pill to swallow. The other thing I think a bit about the JCPOA, and whether there's any chance that the U.S. would re-enter or renegotiate the JCPOA under Harris administration. My prediction is right now in this climate and with everything going on in the Middle East, it might not be a big priority for a Harris administration. I think she would face, issues with respect to Congress, with respect to Republicans in Congress. It would make her, to your point, seem like she was going soft on Iran when the whole time she's campaigned as being a tough on crime and tough on terrorism prosecutor and things like that. So maybe during the first half of her administration, that might not be a priority. If things calm down in the Middle East, I mean, it's anyone's guess. But I will say, to your point, there was a lot of talk, and I think the U.S. got very close to entering back into the JCPOA and during Biden's administration and could not get it done. So if it couldn't get done under those circumstances, I just find it even more difficult to believe that it could be done under a Harris administration with so many rising tensions in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things that when back in the day when Brian and I used to talk about this a lot, because it was really on the front burner at that point in terms of the beginning of the Biden administration, one of the things that I would kept pointing out was that we were getting close to a lot of the deadlines that were coming up, and so it would be really tough to get back into the JCPOA given that a lot of the deadlines were set to run in 3 years. At this point, we're at a lot of the deadlines in the JCPOA, so you'd need to renegotiate a lot of the details of the JCPOA, even if you were to get back into it, because just too much time has passed, and so those deadlines have become obsolete. And they were big deadlines. I mean, there were deadlines that talked about lifting, the president going to Congress to lift the primary sanctions and various things in terms of the supervision that Iran would be under at the end of the deal. Like those things were, we're assuming that there had been peace and harmony the whole time and that we'd had 10 years of good relationships, and so we could start talking about lifting the sanctions permanently. And we're just nowhere near that at that point. And I think that one of them was supposed to take effect in 2025. So, I mean, some big milestones have already passed, and so you'd need to figure out what to do with those. So I think it'd be very hard, even if she decided she wanted to spend a lot of political capital for President Harris to kind of get back into the nuclear deal. And so I expect that will not be a priority early in her term. The one hesitation I have for that, and the part of the other reason that I think that that if President Trump decides that he wants to do this, that there is some possibility of that happening, is the Iranians elected a new president in July, and as I understand it, President Pezeshkian is a moderate by Iranian standards, and at least some of what people thought they might be getting from the Iranian side was someone who would be willing to go back into the JCPOA and potentially start getting rid of some of the sanctions. So you may have a partner on the Iranian side, but the current international climate right now, with essentially Israel and Iran being at war as we speak, makes it really tough to imagine that a President Harris is going to want to spend a lot of capital at the beginning of her term trying to get back into some form of the nuclear deal.
Yeah, and I guess you also have to remember, she potentially, if she does win in November, she also wants to prepare herself likely for a second term.
Right.
So I think you're probably always thinking about that. Now, if in some scenario in another 4 years from now, we are looking at another, let's say, a Kamala Harris second term, and things are drastically different than they are now, never say never. But right now at this time, the JCPOA, just in my personal opinion, seems dead on arrival.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, so we've talked about Iran and about Russia, kind of the big programs. Let's talk about some of the other, embargoed programs and some of the heavily sanctioned programs that are out there. Why don't we start with North Korea, which is something that we really haven't heard a lot about in the Biden administration in terms of any reconsideration of the sanctions program, any burgeoning relations with North Korea. It's been pretty much off the radar, other than sometimes you hear about North Korea kind of helping the Russian war effort, which is not going to make any sort of détente more likely, and shooting off some more rockets in that region. But otherwise, it's been pretty quiet in North Korea from the sanctions point of view. What do we think would happen let's start with a Trump administration with respect to North Korea? Will it continue to be quiet?
I mean, I think we could likely expect Trump to try and thaw again his relationship with Kim Jong Un. If you looked at news years ago during the Trump administration, you would have seen that apparently, there were love letters between them. That might not be literal, but there certainly was a closer relationship, and him meeting with Kim Jong Un, and obviously his predecessors hadn't taken the time to do, and that was a big step. I think that, to your point about Trump being a deal maker, he might try to see if he can negotiate any sort of, be it small, lifting of certain sanctions on Iran, perhaps in exchange for a nuclear weapons program freeze. And for him, that would be seen again, that would make him be seen as this sort of great negotiator. And so I think that these are paths for him to show that he is affecting foreign policy and making change. Again, whether a lot of that would happen is also dependent, I think, because his hands are a little bit tied by certain sanctions on North Korea that are codified in statute. So there's really only so much he could do with respect to North Korea sanctions.
So what about President Harris? Where do we think President Harris is going to start kind of trying to build a closer personal relationship with Kim Jong-un and maybe go from there on sanctions policy?
Based on her track record, and her law enforcement track record, I unfortunately or fortunately don't think that will be the case. I think, we've seen a status quo with North Korea under the Biden administration and under the former Obama administration when it comes to sanctions on North Korea. I will say during the Biden administration, there were some humanitarian-related general licenses that were actually instituted in North Korea sanctions, and I think there has been a big focus by this administration on looking at the impact of sanctions and making sure that some of those humanitarian exceptions remain in place. I do think that is something that could continue under a Harris administration. So the only change I would expect to see with North Korea is really trying to make it easier for NGOs or other types of humanitarian relief to go to places like North Korea or to go to places like Syria that are comprehensively sanctioned.
So that's a good kind of segue into a point that I did want to kind of discuss apart from countries, and that is, when the Biden administration took office, there was a review by the Treasury Department that really talked about the importance of trying to make sure that sanctions didn't block humanitarian aid efforts, even into embargoed countries and heavily sanctioned countries. And some changes were made. The general licenses were written more broadly. The administration and OFAC showed kind of more energy in terms of trying to, help humanitarian transactions actually take place. What do we think that would happen both in a Harris administration, I think you talked about it a little with respect to North Korea, but more broadly, and then with respect to a Trump administration, because my recollection is that in the Trump administration, there were efforts, even with Iran and with the Iran new aggressive measures with respect to the JCPOA, to try and build humanitarian financial channels that would allow for continued humanitarian aid to Iran. So why don't you talk a little bit, kind of compare and contrast where you think the two presidential candidates will be on humanitarian policy in terms of how to make sure that sanctions don't affect those sorts of transactions?
It's a good question. I think that given Vice President Harris and then hearing her talk, I think that we would continue to see those types of Treasury reviews take place to show that the U.S. government is carefully considering and calibrating U.S. sanctions. For example, in the Biden administration, there was a creation of a new division in OFAC, Sanctions Economic Analysis Division, that their job is economists looking at the effect of sanctions and trying to see where certain negative effects can be ameliorated. I think we could see more resources being thrown at things like that, like the Treasury review and a recalibrating of sanctions, particularly given the situation in um, when it comes to the situation in Afghanistan, or when you're talking about what's going in Gaza or the West Bank, to show that the U.S. is really providing more aid to deal with some of the fallout. I guess not just because of sanctions, but because of their current foreign policy ideology. And so I think that we could likely continue to see more humanitarian related exceptions being built into sanctions under a Harris administration. Under a Trump administration, it's really difficult to say because a lot of those programs put in place or tools put in place, such as the Treasury Review and additional offices in OFAC, they do take up resources. And just as was done with the Sanctions Coordinator's Office in the Department of State, that office, like I said before, was abolished. And you do wonder if it's because, under a Trump administration, they are more carefully looking at their budget and what they think is necessary versus what is not. So if you have, reviews such as the Treasury Review or offices like SEED, who don't have the budget to perform those type of reviews, then you can't really expect perhaps it's much focused on recalibration of sanctions. Not to say that you wouldn't have a continuance of a focus on humanitarian activity, and you certainly saw that with respect to the Trump administration trying to have a humanitarian channel with respect to Iran, but some of those tools weren't as widely used as people thought they would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I don't think, at least from what I've seen, that there's a huge disagreement on policy with respect to the idea that sanctions should not cut off humanitarian aid. And I don't think there's really been one within the U.S. government for a long time. As long as I've been doing this, the U.S. government seems to have consistently said, and it's kind of written into IEPA in some sense, that the whole point of sanctions is not to cut off humanitarian trade and hurt the people of the country. It is to kind of stop certain activities within the sanctioned country that the U.S. government doesn't want to take place, and to block particular, usually government or high-level actors that could have an effect on the foreign government's policy. But it's proven to be a very difficult issue to resolve in practice as opposed to at the high policy level, which gets back to your original point, Laura, about kind of who would be the players in a Trump administration and how much experience would they have in terms of actually working with sanctions and figuring out ways to make them work. Harris administration too, but I think that it seems like there'll probably be a continuity of personnel, so you'll have potentially more experience in this area in a Harris administration. Without the experience, it is hard to come up with these sort of technocratic solutions to make these humanitarian channels work in a way that they're effective, because what we've seen administration through administration was these broad general licenses, but if you can't get a payment channel that's set up that works, they don't mean anything because nobody's going to do business if it means kind of you don't get paid. And if you can't get a channel that works, there's the policy is nice in theory and not in practice. So it'll be interesting to see how the two administrations deal with that. I think they'll start from the same place, but where they'll get to, we'll just have to see.
Yep,
All right.
exactly.
Why don't we come to this side of the Atlantic and finish with Venezuela and Cuba? And we'll start with Venezuela. The Trump administration was, at least the first time around, was very aggressive with respect to Venezuela. Unilateral sanctions against the government, against the biggest sector in the Venezuelan economy, that is the oil sector. PDVSA, the national oil company, was put on the SDN list. The statistics that I've seen are pretty striking in terms of how significantly that really tamped down the Venezuelan economy and the oil trade in Venezuela. It's been huge. The Biden administration came in. For the first 3+ years, Venezuela was not a priority in terms of enforcement. The sanctions stayed in place, but my sense was that the risk for non-U.S. nexus transactions plummeted significantly, even in the oil sector. And then, I guess about a year ago at this point, OFAC issued a general license that essentially allowed PDVSA to go back into business. That was only 6 months long, but it was a very broad general license that allowed virtually any type of transaction with PDVSA that you'd want to do with PDVSA. And there was hope that that meant that the sanctions were going to lift. And then, the Maduro government didn't, I think the U.S. would say, didn't keep its word with respect to elections. Now, it did hold elections, but then by lots of different accounts, it didn't count the ballots from the elections. And so essentially you have this situation where the general license is gone and the U.S. and Venezuela are in a very different place. With the Biden administration, where do we think the two administrations will go, either the Harris administration or the Trump administration, with respect to Venezuela?
It's probably easiest again to start with the potential Harris administration, where, I think you will still continue to see the Harris administration assess the situation in Venezuela. If there is any room for any sort of additional negotiation with Venezuela. At this point, there might not be. But even if that's the case, I think you will continue to see calculated responses. You would continue to see calculated responses by the Harris administration. So, for example, with the Biden administration, there had been some recent designations of officials who were purportedly involved in the purported fraudulent election. That those types of designations could likely continue under a Harris administration while they let the situation in Venezuela play out. I think what a Harris administration, like a Biden administration, is carefully looking to is the fact that the Venezuela economy has tanked, and any further blow to the economy could increase migration issues, which Vice President Harris has gotten a lot of flack for as vice president, and so she likely wouldn't want to draw any more attention to some of the border crisis issues that she's gotten criticized for, whether right or wrong. So I do think that you would just, probably continue to see a ramp in designations related to the election. Whether you would see additional sanctions on sectors, probably a little bit less likely, given, the sanctions on PDVSA were really mostly responsible for tanking the Venezuelan economy. With respect to a Trump administration, I think any chance of negotiation might just go away, because President Trump, during his last term between 2017 2019, had really ramped up sanctions at that time on Venezuela, despite knowing that there could be this sort of detrimental effect on the Venezuelan economy. So under Trump's presidency, I wouldn't say it that it's never possible that there couldn't be a large ramp up on Venezuela sanctions. Maybe you won't see a full-scale embargo, but maybe you'll continue to see sanctions on additional sectors of the Venezuelan economy to really show he's being tough on Venezuela. The only scenario I think you see any sort of lifting of sanctions is, again, if there is a way for him to present himself as a deal maker, and let's say there is U.S. interest in getting Venezuelan oil out of Venezuela, which there certainly is, because we've seen a ramp up in parties applying for specific licenses to be able to re-engage or engage for the first time in business with PDVSA. But if there is a big push from big business on President Trump to allow more oil trades to happen, we could see that come out of this, so that Trump can show he is, creating a stronger economy by accepting Venezuelan oil.
Yeah, I mean, that will be interesting to see in terms of how far the Trump administration kind of pushes things with Venezuela. As you were talking, one of the things that struck me is that I do think if you want to kind of talk about the reasons for sanctions policy, when we talked about Russia and Iran, you have countries that are under sanctions for reasons that relate to the threats that they pose to other countries in the region. And in fact, one is an active warfare, since 2022. Another one, Iran, has been kind of in proxy warfare to some extent, and that's part of the reason for their sanctions for a while, and potentially is going to be in active warfare with an U.S. ally, Israel, very soon, if not now. And so you have kind of a sanctions program, and even with North Korea, you had a sanctions program that's justified on nuclear proliferation grounds. So essentially you had kind of threats to the region and threats to the world justifying those sanctions policies. Whether that's true or not, those were the justifications. With respect to Venezuela and Cuba, you don't really have those justifications for those two countries. Essentially with Venezuela, you have kind of this is a bad government that's really bad to its people and does crappy things and abuses human rights. And nobody thinks that's a good thing. But there is some dispute about whether that's a thing, that sanctions is a good tool to deal with. And so essentially, with both Maduro and Castro and the post-Castro Cuban government, the point of sanctions in those countries has been to force out the government. And it's not clear to me that the Biden administration really believed in that policy, although it was essentially trying to at least force elections using the sanctions that were already in place. Whether they would have imposed them in the first place is, in my view, questionable. But it is a good example of kind of different policies between the two, and a good example of once you impose sanctions politically, it's very difficult to get out of those sanctions. Because I don't think the Biden administration would have imposed the Venezuela sanctions against PDVSA in the first place. But they weren't going to lift them because that was a much bigger step, and Congress could potentially have gotten involved. And they'd be lifting them against what is, by all accounts, a terrible government that does bad things to its people. I think, let's turn to Cuba now, and I think that is a good lead into Cuba, because that policy now, the sanctions policy, has been in place for 60 some years. It was designed to drive out the Castro government, which was driven out through the death of Fidel Castro, but not through in any way U.S. sanctions. It's widely believed to be kind of a complete failure, and yet it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, what do we think is going to happen with Cuba in either a Trump administration or a Harris administration?
Either way, and I think most of our listeners will know this, it is very, very difficult for there to be any changes to Cuba related sanctions because they are codified under several statutes, including Libertad. Um, and, making marginal changes to the sanctions regime has occurred. Obviously, it did occur under the Obama administration, which was then rolled back by the Trump administration when you're talking about certain travel related exceptions or U-turn transactions or remittances, general licenses. Um, and some of those were put back under the current Biden administration. So I think one of the big ones in the last few months was an authorization for U-turn transactions where, if there was a non-U.S. originator in a payment and a non-U.S. beneficiary, a U.S. bank in the middle could clear that payment involving Cuba, which was, again, or is in some sense, a very, very big change. Um, do I think that a Harris administration could do more? Likely not. You might be able to get back to some of the broader, uh, travel authorizations that Obama put in place. I think there was, under the Obama administration, a license that allowed an individual to travel to Cuba, if it was going under another authorized
People to people.
exception, the people to people. Now, we have one that says you have to go in a group. Small changes like that, I think, are possible. Anything more than that with Cuba, it's just very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Under a Trump administration, again, I think it's fairly safe to say, I would say 60 to 70% in my view, safe to say that Trump might again roll back those authorizations that the Biden administration put in place, particularly because he does have a large contingency in Florida that supports him. And there's a lot of Cuban Americans in Florida who, really didn't like those Obama era changes with respect to Cuba. So I do think that we would see a lift or a rescinding of those authorizations that the Biden administration put in place. And what that really does, is it really makes it hard for U.S. companies to continue to see how they even would lawfully support business in Cuba. For example, there's authorizations that allow certain transactions with independent entrepreneurs right now in Cuba. And to the extent that those have been happening, how do you keep up that business when you possibly know that every 4 years, in the next 4 years, that license will just go away?
Yeah, I mean Congress has tied the president's hands in this area so completely that it's really hard to see, much more than minor tweaks in this area. I have been struck by the fact that, there have been very few changes since President Biden or President Obama kind of opened up Cuba to some form of kind of general authorization for lots of different travel to and from Cuba. I mean, Cuba is such an interesting program. It's the only program that restricts travel because the programs authorized under IEPA have a travel exemption. I mean, the statute doesn't give the president power to restrict travel, so it's done under TWIA, the Trading with the Enemies Act, and then Congress came in and doubled down on that and prohibited the president from allowing travel to Cuba for tourism purposes. And so even that people-to-people exception that you were talking about, Laura, the one that had allowed for individual travel, it came awfully close to the line of tourism because essentially, as long as you could certify that you were going over to Cuba to kind of meet with individual Cuban people and to gain educational experiences from your interactions with people from a diverse culture or from a different culture, you could get within that exemption to travel to Cuba. And it's really hard to see the daylight between that and tourism, which is clearly still forbidden by U.S. law and you'd need Congress to undo. And so there hasn't been much wiggle room. That said, there have been some tweaks by President Trump, but he didn't repeal. I kind of expected that he would repeal a lot more of the Obama changes, and he really didn't do that in his first term. Maybe he does that in his second term. Maybe he goes back and takes away all the general licenses and we go back to the specific licensing regime. But he didn't move much. He created the Cuba restricted list, did a few other things that kind of heightened the difficulties in dealing with Cuba, but didn't make it much more difficult than it was under the Obama administration, which again didn't loosen things up much because there's just not a lot of wiggle room because of what Congress has done. So it's hard to see kind of big changes coming from either of the presidents with respect to Cuba unless they're prepared to invest a lot of political capital trying to move Capitol Hill on these issues.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And even when it comes to, thinking about the last time there were designations of persons in Cuba, I don't think under either administration we can expect, Cuba targeting to be a big focus. It's just maintain status quo. And I think under a Trump administration, it might be more important to start to repeal what the last administration has done to show that there has been some sort of change.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. We've gone around the world pretty fast with respect to sanctions policies. Any last words, or do we just sit and wait for, 30 days to find out who's going to be the next president of the United States and then wait until January to see what they do?
Yeah, I mean, either way, I think even when the next president takes their oath into office, we will have a bit of a waiting period to see what their policy will be. To see whether President Trump does try to roll back some of those Russia-related sanctions, to see whether we see more humanitarian exceptions being created under a Harris administration. Either way, I think there's a bit of a waiting period, but certainly I think as lawyers who practice in this area on a day-to-day basis, we are all on our toes.
All right. Well, thank you for taking out your crystal ball and talking through this with me, Laura. And thanks, everyone, for listening. And stay sanctions free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.